All right, hey everybody, welcome to the next installment. By now you should have watched your weather coding video and reviewed those two links that I gave you, or the link and the PDF that I gave you to view. All of that put together will help you through those questions. Again, the video was just simply a basic introduction. I really wanted you to read and discover the remainder of that information on your own. If you have any other questions, of course, you can look to try to get a hold of me and let me know what those might be. I like the feedback. So you also should have gone through your definitions video. It doesn't cover absolutely every definition you're going to find on the test or every word, but it's a good place to start. And then of course we come in here and we can now begin the nuts and bolts part of the 107 itself. So the first thing we want to do is go over a couple of administrative things. Once you get your license, you will never have to pay the $175 or whatever the fee is by the time you're watching this video. You'll never have to pay that again, because then from that point on you can simply go online to the FAA's website through the FAA Fast Team portal, and you can retake your next test and get a printout from the system that would allow you to continue flying Part 107. And you just keep that with your license and keep that on you at any time that you're actually out performing 107 operations. So you only have to re-update that once every 2 years, or they say 24 months. So make sure that you know that for your test. As well, if you get caught falsifying, reproducing, or altering your license information fraudulently, they can suspend your license, revoke your license, not allow you, to get another license, and they can also fine you. So you don't want to mess around with that, because the minimum fine that the FAA doles out in these types of situations is $1,100. And so if you don't want to have to shell out $1,100 for something really simple and silly, then don't get involved with reproducing, altering, or fraudulently doing anything with your certificate. As well, there are similar fines and repercussions if you get caught cheating on the test. So make sure you're not involved in that. There are questions on the test about that very fact. So also, if you change your address, you want to make sure that you notify the FAA within 30 days so that they have your new address on file. If not, then you should ground yourself until you have chances to get that information to the FAA. All right, let's move on to pre-flight. So every pilot in command of a SUAS or a drone is required to make sure that their aircraft is airworthy and safe for flight. So this would mean you'd want to, check that aircraft, check everything that's hanging off that aircraft, like your camera or any other, like if you've got a grabber on the bottom of there to hold on to stuff or whatever. You want to make sure that everything on that aircraft is secure and nothing will fall off. You want to check the body of the aircraft to make sure that there's no signs that it has suffered any damage since the last time you flew it. You want to check the arms and make sure they're not cracked. You want to check your motors inside and out to make sure that there's no signs of rust, that no debris have gotten inside them. You want to run your fingers along the inside of your rotors to make sure that there's no imperfections or defects, anything sticking up off of them that might cause them to not have the same aerodynamic qualities that you would want for safe flight. I even like to bend mine just a little bit, just a hair, just to make sure that there aren't any hairline fractures inside or out that I might have missed. So basically just making sure that aircraft is safe for flight. It's also good to have a checklist to do that by, because if you ever get called into question by the FAA or a court system, it's a good idea to have documents. I run my operations by the whole idea of CYA, which I call cover your assets. And the only way to properly perform CYA is with the 3Ds, which is document, document, document. So part of that documentation is showing that every single time I fly, I run with the same set of checklists that, I go down and I literally check off the things as I've looked at them, so that I can put that in my 3-ring binder along with the date and time of that flight, and even some small description of where I was during that flight, so that if I'm ever called into question, I can say that not only did I have a checklist that I created using the standard industry best practices for this particular aircraft, or even better than that, the manufacturer's suggested checklist if one's available. So either using one of those two, and of course, the manufacturer's checklist is the priority. If you can find that, that's the number one thing. If you can say that you're running by the manufacturer's suggested checklist for that aircraft, that's perfect. But in lieu of having one, if they don't provide it, then the second best thing is to have an industry standard best practice checklist for doing the types of things you're doing with that particular aircraft. So if you've got that and you're running by that same aircraft checklist every time, and you can show proof of that, that's golden. That's a great way to cover your assets, basically. All right. So the next thing you have to be concerned about during a pre-flight, besides your aircraft, is making sure that the weather is good and that you can fly and not violate the Part 107 regulations on visibility and cloud clearances. For visibility, you have to have 3 statute miles of visibility. For cloud clearances, you can't be any closer than 500 feet from the bottom of a cloud or the base of the clouds, and you cannot be any closer than 2,000 feet horizontally. Now, all of those type of measurements are kind of hard to do, so it's a lot of guesswork. But there are ways to kind of gauge that system. If you can, you can use the weather that we talked about, getting a weather report via SkyVector, and or not via SkyVector, but through aviationweather.com. And if you can do that and get your weather, then you can basically get the visibility if you have a weather reporting system that's close by. If you don't have a weather reporting system close by, you could go by using Google Earth Pro, finding some locations on the ground with some large identifiable man-made object or something like that, and you could run a measurement tool out from the particular item to where you're going to be flying from to see if when you get out there, if you've got 3 miles of visibility. If you can find some landmark or a man-made object that you know will be 3 miles away from the location where you're standing to do your work, and you can get out there and you can see that man-made object, and it's 3 miles away because you measured it on Google Earth Pro, then that would be another way to do it. But none of that, is guaranteed. You don't always have that on every job. So some of it is just, taking extrapolations from the information available, your closest airports, weather reports, and all that. And then, of course, just being prudent, going out there and being reasonable, looking and saying, gosh, I kind of know what 3 miles, statute miles look like, and obviously we can't see that today. So that and the cloud clearances, there's not really many ways to know other than, the basic information that you have from your nearest reporting station, and of course then what you can see with your own eyes. Does it look reasonable? But that's the rules. 3 statute miles visibility, and 2,000 miles horizontal. 2,000 feet horizontally, and 500 feet below the clouds. As long as you got those things covered, you're good to go. You cannot ever fly above a cloud because that usually puts you out of line of sight. But nonetheless, even if it's not out of sight, the FAA guidelines say that you cannot fly above clouds. One at a time is the next one here. You can only fly one aircraft at a time. There is a possibility of getting a waiver from that, so that you can fly multiple aircraft at one time, but it's relatively hard to get and usually requires some pretty intense software that connects to your aircraft systems so that they can all fly together safely and get down to the ground quickly if need be. But otherwise, unless you're like Disney World, flying 800 aircraft and doing beautiful pictures in the sky and all that stuff, you're just going to fly one at a time. All right, so remote ID did come out in March of this year. It became standard. There's two different types of remote ID. Standard is the type of ID that comes on the newer aircraft. So if you've got a later model drone, they should have it built in. If they're being sold here in the United States, they have it built in. If they don't have it built in, you can purchase a broadcast module and have that affixed to the outside of your aircraft. And then of course the module will sync with the numbers for your aircraft and your registration. All of that has to go in together. When you go on what is that called, Drone Zone with the FAA to apply for your registration for your aircraft. Now there's a space in there where you can put your broadcast module pin, or not pin, but the number for it, for lack of a better word, I guess your serial number. Yeah, so you want to take that serial number for your aircraft and match it to your broadcast module and put that in Drone Zone when you apply for your registration. That way the FAA knows that that registration is for that particular aircraft, and etc. You can operate in these areas that are known as FRIAs, which is an FAA registered zone where you can fly without remote ID. But these areas are small, and they're put together by CBOs, which are community-based organizations that they're mainly for hobby flight. They're put together. The CBO is in place for the whole purposes of promoting hobby flight, and that's the real reason behind FRIAs. You can fly there, and you can even do 107 work in a FRIA, but again, they're so small and so few that you're not really going to be able to count on that to do work for a 107 standpoint. As your crew goes, not only do you have to make sure that you establish a PIC before you fly, if you also are having a VO and or a person manipulating your controls, you need to make sure that everybody that's on that flight is of sound mental health and physical condition to fly an aircraft or to be part of a crew that is flying an aircraft. Now, you're not necessarily a professional, neither am I, in mental health or medical conditions, but nonetheless, the FAA cites us pilots, us remote pilots in command, as being the ones that will have to decide these factors. So as a prudent human being, if you don't think a person meets this criteria, you should not have them working on your crew, because you might have to be called in front of a tribunal or a court at some point and have to explain why you allowed this person or that person to be on your crew when it should have been known to you that they were not of sound mental and or physical condition to be part of a crew. You also have to know enough about human behavior and all that to know if people that are coming on your job are possibly under the influence of alcohol and or drugs. If you pick up on this, and any prudent human being should have been able to tell that somebody was not acting appropriately or did not seem to be with it enough to be on that crew, that they may be on alcohol or drugs or under the influence, you should not be allowing them to be a part of your operation. All right, let's go back here and look at in-flight stuff. All right, looks like we got a lot to cover here. Operating rules. Let's look at airspace. There's two different major types of airspace, and that would be controlled and uncontrolled airspace. For the most part, airports are either controlled or uncontrolled, and that depends strongly on is there a tower associated with that airport. So if an airport has a tower, it is controlled airspace. And there's a few different types of airspace it could be, and we're going to talk more specifically about those airspaces in another segment. But for right now, you need to know there is such a thing as controlled and uncontrolled airspace. And in controlled airspace, we need to have permission from the FAA to fly in them. If you're in the vicinity of an uncontrolled airport, you can fly there without FAA approval, but you must be really vigilant, extra safe with what you're doing, because there is regulation that requires you to yield to other aircrafts, and it is important that you do so, and that you don't inhibit the flight path of a piloted aircraft. In fact, drones, UAS, are the lowest on the totem pole when it comes to right of way. So, and we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. But if you do get around a controlled airport, there is a way for you to request that permission to fly within it, within their area, and that is through what's called low altitude authorization and notification capability. It's in several apps that you can apply to your phone, and that's something that you look into once you get out of, get past your 107 test and you're ready to go out there and fly. That's when it'd be a good time to start looking up what services are out there, what apps are out there that you can use. One that's really famous is called Aloft, and you might write that down as some information now to look up not only that particular application for your phone, but also others that may also be just as good, if not better, for you. So look them up and check them out. All right. So next thing we're going to talk about is flight rules. We must maintain VLOS, which is visual line of sight, at all times with the aircraft. And so the FAA understands that when you're out there doing work, you may run into an occurrence when you're maybe doing a tower inspection or a roof inspection or something like that, where you're going to momentarily lose sight of your aircraft. They say that's okay as long as it's part of what you're doing for your job and that it's only momentary. The problem is the FAA isn't willing to let us know how much time that is. So it's up to you as a prudent individual to not lose sight of that aircraft for any any long period of time, anything that could cause problems. Because certainly if a problem does occur, and it was during a time when you weren't watching it or wasn't able to see it for some reason, then that's going to be called into question, and your decision making in that particular situation will be called into question. So just make sure you're able to argue a good case as to why this met VLOS and the momentary lapse of view kind of standard to that. It is it's actually every aircraft pilot's, problem. It's their responsibility to see and avoid other aircraft. And that's really why you have to maintain VLOS of an aircraft, is because you have to be able to see where that aircraft is and what it's doing to make sure that it's not going to strike another aircraft or even something that's man-made or a tree or anything like that. So it's your responsibility to see and avoid other things and other aircraft. We are the lowest on the totem pole, as I've said before, when it comes to right of way. So we have to get out of the way of every other aircraft. Now, that doesn't necessarily void the requirement for other aircraft to also see us, but we're smaller. Most of the time, we're tiny, and it's very hard for someone in an aircraft to be able to see us. So the bigger gravity, the higher weight of this goes to us as UAS pilots to see piloted aircraft and steer clear of them. All right, so altitude limits. Normally, under normal circumstances, we are only allowed to fly up to 400 feet. So you cannot fly over 400 feet. The only time when this is accepted is if you are near a man-made object and you're within 400 feet of the object, then you can travel up to the top of that object and an additional 400 feet above that object. So let's say you're out doing tower inspections, and during that tower inspection, you need to go above it to take pictures downward of it. Then as long as you're close enough, as long as you're within 400 feet of that aircraft, of that man-made object, then you can fly up to and above it by an additional 400 feet, so long as that extra 400 feet or any of that distance above 400 feet does not put you into another type of airspace that might be controlled. So you might have taken off in an uncontrolled airspace at the bottom of your job, at the bottom of this tower, and then as you're flying up the side of it, even though you're 400 feet, close to it, if you start running into the next level of airspace that puts you in a controlled airspace, you would need authority to fly in it. Now, when you're doing Lance on the phone, they'll give you authority to fly into airspace that's surrounding airports usually, like smaller airports and even some of the bigger airports near where the airspace runs all the way to the ground. But when you're talking about some of these larger airspaces that are up higher, you're probably going to need to go through Drone Zone to get that certification or that waiver to fly in that area. So Lance may not cover it. So if you're going to get a job like that, if you're quoting a job like that, you may want to go out to that area and see if you can pull a Lance waiver, to fly at that altitude that you want to fly at in that area. If it comes back and tells you no, that it can't authorize that, then you need to do that on Drone Zone. And when you do that on Drone Zone, they tell you it could take as much as 90 days to get that approval. So just be thinking about that. It's information for you beyond the test. It's not necessarily something that you're going to see on the test, but good information to know as you're becoming a professional pilot. Speed limits in the sky. Now, they're going to come at you on the test with two different speeds. So one of them is going to be in kilometers per hour, and the other one's going to be in miles per hour. So your miles per hour speed is 100 miles an hour, which makes your kilometers speed 87. So we're not allowed to go over 87 knots, right? And you're not allowed to go over 100 miles an hour. So 87 knots, 100 miles per hour. All right. When it comes to the business end of an aircraft, one of the biggest questions tends to be, can we put property on board the aircraft and transport it for hire? And the answer is yes, that can be done. But of course, you have to follow all the regulations of Part 107 in order to do that. So one of the biggest regulations that actually even mentions the transport of property for compensation and hire is the rule on operations for moving vehicles. Now, the rule on operating from a moving vehicle says that you can operate a drone from a moving vehicle, so long as you're in a sparsely populated area and you're not the driver of the vehicle. So, and that basically covers cars, land-borne vehicles. When it comes to flying a drone from another aircraft, that is strictly out. Doesn't matter if you're in the back seat of the aircraft or you fly an aircraft, doesn't matter. You cannot fly a drone from an aircraft, which can from a vehicle, a car, as long as you're in a sparsely populated area, as long as you're not the driver, and as long as you're not transporting property for compensation and hire. So people then ask me, well, what about boats? Well, boats are almost always moving. Even if you have them anchored, they're still moving around in the water. So you want to not fly for compensation or hire with property on board, that you're transporting from one place to another for compensation or hire out of a boat. But you could still take pictures and videos and that sort of thing for hire off of a boat, so long as you were in an area that was sparsely populated. So you'd want to get, well offshore. Here in Florida, we have beaches are packed, at least in the summertime. So if you wanted to do something close to land, it would be best to try to do that in the winter months. Or you could get far off from land and do it, out where it's sparsely populated. There's not a whole bunch of boats out there and that sort of thing. So people always ask, well, what sort of job would you do out there? And I say that there are companies that are trying to sell boats, and they'll want video of the boat in motion, making big splashes through the waves or whatever, just it operating through the water. So there's a lot of that, and so there's an example of a job that you might do well off the shore from land. Hazardous operations. This is the catch-all that the FAA uses so that if you have an accident or something goes wrong or there's a complaint against you for the way you're operating your aircraft, and they come out and check into what you're doing, and maybe you're meeting all of the regulations for Part 107, but you're flying in what they consider to be a hazardous operation or in a reckless manner, anything like that, then they can fine you or cite you under operating your aircraft in a hazardous manner. And this especially happens when there's an accident. So let's talk about hazardous materials. And this one, we got to take a look in the little bubble down here because there's a little more to it. Let's take a look at this definition. Let's look at it up close. It says under 49 CFR 171.8, 172.101, 173, and 49 USC 5103 that it includes hazardous substances, hazardous wastes, marine pollutants, explosive radioactive material, infectious, flammable, or combustibles, toxic, oxidizing, corrosive, or compressed gas. It really includes just about anything that you could consider hazardous. I always tell my students, if it goes bang, explodes, catches on fire, or can make people ill, that's the sort of thing we're talking about. Dropping things. Dropping things can be done so long as it doesn't create any undue hazards, as we were talking about before, hazardous operations, and that it won't damage people or property. So it can be done. But what about lighting, nighttime flight? When you're flying in the daytime, you're not required to have any lighting on board your aircraft with the drone. If you're flying, though, anytime from the time the sun sets until 30 minutes after it has set, that is called civil twilight. Civil twilight also is that time 30 minutes prior to sun up until the sun comes up. And during nighttime, any of those civil twilight and nighttime times, you're supposed to have lighting on your aircraft that will allow you to see up to, or people can see your aircraft lighting up to 3 statute miles, which is pretty bright. And typically you have to make sure that you're not being hoodwinked when you go out to purchase some aircraft lighting. Make sure that it is guaranteeing you that it meets the requirements for the FAA lighting requirements. And then operations over people. There is directly versus indirectly involved, and then stationary vehicle. So the rules still stand that you typically are not supposed to fly over people unless those people are directly involved with your operation. That'd be you as the RPIC, the person manipulating the controls, and any of the VOs, so your visual observers. You can have 15 or 20 visual observers, and as long as they're part of the operation and you're using them, they all have to have visual line of sight of the aircraft from takeoff until landing. But if those people are involved to that level on your operation and they're providing you with feedback and all that, then you can fly over them. So if people are not directly involved, they're not part of your crew, you cannot fly over them. And that would include if they are, let's say you're out doing video at a concert, and the people on the stage are fully aware that you're there doing concert footage, and they hired you to do that. You still can't fly directly over them or a crowd. If they have brought a crowd in front of the stage, you can't fly over any of that, typically, because they're not part of the people directly involved in your operation. Now, when it comes to vehicles, typically, the rule had always stated that you can't fly over a vehicle unless that vehicle is stationary. And if there are people inside that vehicle, they have to be covered so that it would protect them from a falling aircraft. Same thing with people. If they are sheltered under something that would stop, the falling aircraft, then, you're also covered, to fly over them. So if they're under an awning or something like that, that's, part of a structure, you're probably going to be good with the FAA on that. But if somebody's simply holding an umbrella, probably not so much. So let's look at some of the other things that are involved with the operation over people, because these that I just gave you are the overall rules, and they still stand unless your aircraft meets one of the requirements that we're about to talk about. So let's take a look at over people a little bit closer. In fact, let's pull that in. All right. So let's look at these categories of eligibility. You have 4 different categories. And in the first category, we start with aircraft that are 0.55 pounds or under, and that would be 249 grams or below. So a lot of times when you go to purchase an aircraft, they'll say that this aircraft is 249 grams or below. So that's why I give you that information. But primarily, under the law, it's 0.55 pounds or under. If you have that type of an aircraft, sure, you can fly it over people without any restrictions. You're good to go. But if you plan to fly over an open air assembly, which is really, first of all, not well defined by the FAA, but if in your best thinking, you are starting to fly over what appears to be an assembly of people, then if you have that 0.55 or below aircraft, then you could do it as long as you were either the aircraft comes with remote ID or you have a remote broadcast module on there that does not take that aircraft outside of the gross takeoff weight of 0.55 pounds. One thing people get screwed up on a lot is they think, oh, I've got a 249 gram aircraft which meets the requirements of the 0.55 or below. But as soon as you put that module on the outside, it takes you up a couple of grams, which throws you over the limit. So then you could not fly over the open air assembly. And in fact, it would put you into the secondary category if it would even meet that. So over moving vehicles, yes, you can take a .55 or below aircraft and fly it over moving vehicles with sustained operations, but only on a closed site with notice. So you can fly over them moving on the street. But if you're going to stay sustained over the top of a vehicle, that can only be done on a closed site and with the occupants of the vehicle notified that they are part of this, situation where they're going to be underneath an aircraft that is flying over them sustained. But again, if you're just flying over a street and you're continuing to move and you're not going to go out and back and across and back and across, the street several times, then you're covered to go ahead and fly across once or twice, again, with reasonableness. And that's category 1. Also in category 1, if you look to the bottom of the screen here, it says all aircraft flying over people must have no exposed rotating parts that can lacerate skin upon contact. So that includes your category 1 aircraft at 0.55 pounds or below, which means those guards that you have on the aircraft to keep the rotors from being exposed also have to be part of that total weight of the aircraft upon takeoff that meets this 0.55 or below. So then they have category 2, and it says 11 foot-pounds here. Now that's 11 feet or foot-pounds of kinetic transfer energy. And so what they're talking about here is that if your aircraft will not cause 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy transfer or greater, and the damage that would be caused by 11 foot-pounds or greater is not going to happen, then you would meet the requirements of the category 2 eligibility. If you're going for eligibility on these upper level, anything past 1 categories, then you have to make sure that aircraft has a document of compliance, which you can go out on the FAA website and check to see if the particular model of aircraft that you want to fly is, of course, listed on that document of compliance. I believe you actually put in the serial number for the aircraft, if I'm not mistaken, and it will tell you if that aircraft has a document of compliance. If not, you can at least go by the type and style model of aircraft that you're flying. That aircraft has to be permanently marked to say that it complies with category 2. And when the manufacturer that creates this drone creates it, they're also supposed to have a list of pilot operating instructions that come along with the aircraft, and you should have that in your possession, in your binder or someplace where if someone from the FAA or law enforcement walked up on your operation, you would have all that readily available to be able to prove to them that you're meeting all the requirements with category 2. So if you have category 2, it pretty much goes the same as category 1. Yes, you can fly over people without restrictions. Yes, you can fly over an open air assembly if you have remote ID. And yes, you can fly over vehicles that are moving if you plan to do that, and if you're going to be flying over them with sustained operations. You can only do that on a closed site with notice. Where things change a little bit is in category 3, where now the damage done to a person, if the aircraft was to strike them, would not be any greater than, would not be 25 foot-pounds of kinetic energy or greater. You would also have to have your document of compliance. The aircraft would have to be marked, and you would have to have your pilot operating instructions. But the rules change a little bit here. Yeah, you can fly over people, but the place where you fly over them has to be a closed site. All of the people have to have notice, and there is no flying sustained unless you're following the default rules. So what this basically means is you can't you can't just go around flying over people randomly. So you can fly over people, but it has to be on a location. So let's go back to that concert footage. So let's say the band wants to be on stage. You've got a stage set. You have people checking the perimeter. No additional people are coming onto this site. It's closed down. You can have fences. You can have gates. You can have people standing at intervals to keep people from coming into the site. But it has to be considered a closed site. And then everyone that's going to be in this video, that's going to have the drone flying over them, would need to be on notice that this will be occurring. And even then, you're not really supposed to be flying over them sustained. Can you fly over an open air assembly? It says no. So that would take you out of your concert footage, except for maybe those people on the outer edge. And then over moving vehicles, yes, with sustained operations only on a closed site with notice. And then 4, category 4 aircraft is completely in a new realm, because now the aircraft has to have an airworthiness certificate. It can operate within any set of limitations in approved flight manual. So the aircraft manufacturer has to have an entire manual, just like you do in a piloted aircraft. And there will be maintenance requirements with that as well. So that's something that's greater than 25 foot-pounds of kinetic energy should it strike a person. So yes, you can fly over people with that aircraft, and then it's restricted only by the limitations in the manual. Yes, you can fly over open air assemblies, but not sustained without remote ID. So you can fly over them, but you have to have a remote ID if you're going to fly over a open air assembly, and if you're going to be over them with a sustained flight. And over moving vehicles, yes, following the limitations in the approved manual. And again, this goes back to a manual that they would provide you from the manufacturer. So, last thing is waivers. Yes, you can get a waiver for all of these things. Operating from a moving vehicle, so you could do it in a non-sparsely populated area, or from a boat or different things. You're never going to get one to fly, do it from another aircraft. So hang that one up if you're having that thought. You can get a waiver from having to have your anti-collision lighting on. You can get a waiver from VLOS, except if you're flying cargo for hire. You can get a waiver from having to have a visual observer, which it's not in the rules anyway. You do not have to have a visual observer. It's not part of the law. But if you were to apply for a waiver, let's say on Drone Zone, to do some particular action that's not allowed normally under the regulations, and you stated as one of the caveats to that application request for waiver that you were going to have visual observers, then you would need them. And then you could turn around and ask for a waiver to not have them. Also, normally you don't have to have a VO, but if you should have a VO, and you as a reasonable Part 107 pilot should know that the operation you're doing could be hazardous without one, then that wouldn't stop the FAA, if there was an accident or something, from saying, oh, well, it would have been more prudent for you to have these visual observers, so maybe you flew in a way, in a manner that was hazardous, and undue hazards occurred because of it. So something you want to consider. You can get a waiver from operating with multiple UAS, yielding the right of way. And people always ask, well, why would you not want to yield right away to another aircraft or be in such a close vicinity to another aircraft that there's a possibility of having an accident? And I always tell people, there's folks out there that might want to sell an airplane, and they might want to show it landing at an airport. If you were at a non-towered airport and you had a waiver, and which would also include that you would have to have something set up with the pilot of the aircraft that you're trying to film. If all those types of factors were in there, and you were able to mitigate the risks by everyone communicating and those types of things, then you might be able to get this waiver done. And it would be a good reason to have it. So operating over people, operation in certain airspace, so you can get waivers, including on LAANC. That's really what LAANC is really all about, is operations in certain airspace, and that would be your controlled airspaces near airports. But you can also get waivers for other airspaces that you're not allowed into normally, that you can't get LAANC through. But those waivers are gotten through Drone Zone. And then operating limitations for the UAS would be above your 400 feet, faster than 100 miles an hour or 87 knots. And then operating over moving vehicles, so that you can also get a waiver for that. Now, all of those waivers have to be written with an understanding of the risks that are inherent in those operations, and some kind of discussion on how you intend to mitigate the risk factors. As long as you do that and you do it well, you can probably achieve a waiver to get some of these things done. And with that, we have reached the completion of the business end and the operating rules, and therefore the nuts and bolts of Part 107. You just had the breakdown of the full set of regulations. I look forward to seeing you in the next session.